Hey, U.S. History students again. It's Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing well. This is Baker's Corner, Baker's Backyard. And today and this week, we get to basically look at the transition from our Federalist presidents and John Adams to our first president that we associate with the Jefferson era, which is going to be Thomas Jefferson. So lesson one, we'll basically look at the, the importance of Adams's one term. And then for next time, you will have a lot to think about with the transition to Thomas Jefferson. If you're using your course guide for this this week, you're going to be using page 2, I believe it is. And so let's go ahead and get started. So what do we want to really understand about John Adams? First of all, we want to understand probably one of the biggest things that came out of his administration, which is going to be a nullification crisis, right? So this idea of what is nullification, what is a good definition, a good working nuts and bolts definition. We're going to define it, and more importantly, we're going to talk about the causation that we have. Okay, it creates a series of effects, which eventually will be people, more or less, people like Madison and Jefferson, that are not really on board with what these acts actually did, right? So stay tuned to that. That's the second thing as well. So we want to kind of throw in a thinking skill that we talked a little bit about in week 1, but causation, right? And so causation is always going to have something that leads to something. And of course, the effect is going to be the result, okay? Thirdly, we can't leave out John Adams's foreign policy by any means. But, you know, the question with that is that does he completely follow through with his predecessor, George Washington, in his policy of neutrality, right? All of these presidents, guys, after George Washington, keep in mind, they're going to have a big amount of responsibility or even decision making to make. Do I do things exactly like, pardon me, the first president of the United States? Or on the other hand, do I basically define the office in a sense on my own terms? Every president since Washington has done that. The question is, what do you do with this pressure given that Washington was the first guy? And then last but not least, which is where we'll pick up in our second lesson of this week, which will be on the era of Jefferson, we're going to take a look at the famous and infamous, as Jefferson referred to it as, in I think it was his inaugural, this Revolution of 1800. And that sounded like I was like, dun, dun, dun. But that's really what we're going to get into next time. So let's go and get started with John Adams. I like to start off with this quote. I took a grad class a few years ago, and basically the professor shared this. And this is actually a little quote that I like to share to kind of give us an idea about what Adams is kind of up against as far as, you know, people comparing him or contrasting him with his predecessor, George Washington. And of course, that is Abigail Adams, who is really one of your more famous women that gets a lot of attention with things like Republican motherhood and, of course, trying to expand even some of the rights of women in this early time period. But this even goes back, as you can see, to July of 1775, which is well before the 1796 election that Adams actually won. But look at what she says in a letter or correspondence. She said, "You had prepared me to entertain a favorable opinion of him," talking about who? Washington. "But I thought the half was not told me. Those line of Dryden instantly occurred to me. Mark his majestic fabric. He's a temple sacred," capital there, keep in mind, "by birth and built by hands divine. His soul's the deity that lodges there, nor is the pile unworthy of the god," unquote. Now, I don't know if a lot of us in modern day times talk like this. Got to give her a lot of credit for having a lot of really neat vocabulary to her statement. But guys, in a nutshell, you know what she's really telling her husband? Whether this was appropriate or not, you could debate. This guy is a stud, talking about Washington, and you really didn't tell me what to expect fully. Meeting him definitely solidified what he's all about. Okay, so guys, imagine if you have a person who eventually is going to be a first lady that has these kinds of ideas about, you know, Washington, his demeanor. Imagine the kind of pressure that her husband is going to be under from the public, people within his own party, the Federalist Party, and that's a pretty big thing. So an interesting observation to get us started. Now, her influence, does not go away when it comes to the idea of, okay, well, this Washington guy is pretty special. Okay. And so, a lot of you, if you read letters by her before, during, also after the revolution, she's a really big advocate of a lot of these things. And so look at what she says. Just a couple of examples. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Okay. But she doesn't stop there. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be what? Tyrants if they could. Now, you got to remember, guys, at this point in time, whether it's pre-revolution, during, or even afterwards, a lot of Americans have a very bad taste in their mouths of tyranny due to King George III, right? So being told that you're abusing power, or at least conveyed in her words, that is not usually something that most people are going to respond well to, okay? But she's trying to make a point about the presence of course, male authority and the need to basically expand the rights and opportunities of women. I like the next quote. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. You're going to be reading a little bit about what Hamilton and also Thomas Jefferson have to say, back then about rebellion in your weekly document exercise. And look what she says next. And will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So, the idea of, is that kind of like an earlier form of what a lot of people call civil disobedience? If the law is unjust, then you basically oppose it. You accept the consequences, right? Down the line, Susan B. Anthony, who of course is very adamant about women's suffrage. You can't really talk about that in, especially her time, until of course the 19th Amendment, without her name being associated with it. Okay. But anyway, a lot of you know the story with her practicing civil disobedience, trying to vote when it was, of course, against the law, and accepting, the consequence. And then I like the next quote a lot because I think it illustrates the need for universal education across the board. I regret the trifling, narrow, contracted education of the females of my own country. Now, this is interesting, guys, because in the next about 3 weeks from now, when we start to look at, when we start to look at the idea of reform movements, we have to really keep in the back of our minds that there's going to be a really big emphasis on things like feminism for women, but also an education movement to not just educate women, but to also educate a lot of the people in society, right? So that is where we see the influence of course, Abigail Adams. Now, what about Adams's presidency? Well, this is where you get into, remember, one-term president, as his future son, who will be president, John Quincy, will be in the 1820s, okay? And so what happens is you've got this rivalry. Now, the story with the 1796 election is you've got Adams becoming the president and you've got Thomas Jefferson becoming the vice president, okay? They represent two different political parties. They were, of course, pretty close in a lot of ways during the Revolution, but things have not exactly developed as favorably into this time period. So this is not going to be a working relationship that's going to be as easy as, not that every VP president relationship is easy, but certainly it's not going to be one that really is going to be the best in the world. Okay. And so what we notice, guys, just a little bit of context here, is that we still have a Federalist Congress and we also have a Federalist president, right? So that's going to be really important. If both sides are going to work together, meaning the Federalists in both branches, then what we find is that, of course, these laws are going to basically be passed that in some cases will favor Federalists, okay? And that's exactly what's going to happen with the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay? So the Alien and Sedition Acts, we'll kind of jump a little bit in this slide, is a series of acts. When we think of alien, we want to think of the idea of immigrants that are entering the country. And we think of course, sedition. We think of, in a sense, kind of something that goes against, your government or falsely accuses a government official. And so you could argue, guys, what the Federalists are trying to do here is they're trying to keep conditions politically favorable to their cause, right, or their party or their set of interests, okay? And so the Alien Act, as you can see, is that there's already been a citizenship, guideline, but it's not really clear, right? You could argue it's not really going to become, okay, the 14th Amendment is what defines citizenship more, I guess you would call completely. But at the end of the day, the Constitution does address being a citizen, either to be a House rep or a senator, or even being a natural born citizen to be a president. Okay. And so what we find is that this Alien Act is going to basically make it, as you can see here, increasing residency for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. And it also is going to give the president a degree of power, right, or authority to basically deport suspicious aliens, right? Now, a couple of things I want you all to think about. If you're in class, we'll talk about this. If you're watching this, it's something to kind of give yourself some thought with. Is that, first of all, what's the big deal with making 5 to 14 years? Well, think about it like this. What's probably the most common thing that most citizens will do to exercise their political authority and rights or voice? And the answer is voting. Okay, so if you're delaying that opportunity for citizenship, you're basically delaying the opportunity for a lot of these eventual immigrants or citizens to basically become voting citizens. Okay, and so you might say, well, man, why is that a big deal? Well, you've got, some arguments out there. The one that I came across in some readings is that it seems like, the French, right? Remember, the Federalists were more pro-British. The Jeffersonians were more pro-France, partly due to their leanings, in some ways with the best foreign policy and all those things. But the argument is that, okay, maybe these immigrants are going to be more likely to vote toward our opposition, right? Meaning the Jeffersonians. And so therefore, they're trying to protect their set of political interests. The other thing is the president has the power to deport suspicious aliens or people that are into the country that have immigrated. Now, the question is suspicious. What do we define as suspicious? I have a student that comes in, rolls his eyes at me. Is that suspicious? That might be a little bit goofy. That might be somebody being a little bit rude, but is that suspicious? Does that make them a threat to the United States, the presidency, etc.? All right. So there's a big can of worms, as the saying goes, about this. And we haven't even gotten to the Sedition Act yet, guys, but you can see the handwriting on the wall. Not everybody, especially people like Jefferson and eventually Madison and others, they're not going to be on board with this because it's like, well, this is a lot of federal government power. And you're giving the presidency and the Congress creates these laws as the Federalist Congress. Of course, John Adams is going to, of course, sign them into law. It's giving the federal government a lot of power. So again, that idea of authority. But look what the Sedition Act does. It's the nuts and bolts of this is that it's called acts because there were several of them, keep in mind, but it's illegal to publish false or malicious accusations against the government. Now, think back to what we talked about last week with lesson 1, where you've got a Bill of Rights that is set to protect the rights of the citizens against abuse of government. It's set to basically allow for the functioning of democracy, at least in principle, right? And here it is, you have an act of Congress, which again is passed successfully and is eventually signed into office or law, if you will, by the president. And I mean, imagine what is false? Well, libel, those kinds of things, slander, those things are not appropriate, right? Makes me think of the first Spider-Man movie where, Peter Parker doesn't like the fact that the paper is making him look to look really bad, or at least, as a bad guy. And he says it's slander, right? And the editor takes the cigar out of his mouth and he's like, I resent that. Slander is spoken. In print, it's libel. Well, at the end of the day, if it's false, then obviously you're printing basically on a lack of truth that could really ruin people. Okay. And so the question is, okay, are they trying to limit the speech of people because they're trying to protect maybe the image of Adams, who, by the way, is not going to be the most popular president then and even now. Okay. And the other side of this is malicious. Define malicious. Somebody comes in and they're like, Baker, you're a weenie, right? Or something like that. Is that malicious? It might be rude. I would not condone you saying that, but you know what I'm getting at here. Is it malicious? Is the intent to ruin their reputation. Well, that's where nullification comes into it. So the cause is the Alien and Sedition Acts, limiting the rights of people, basically. Okay. The effects are the nullification response. This is a key term in your notes, guys, or in your course guides, but you want to commit this to your noggins. Cite it to your dog, cite it to your parakeet, cite it to whoever you need to basically make sure that it's up in your memory. It's not going to leave it. It's the right of states, governments, pardon me, to declare unconstitutional federal laws. Now, as you can imagine, the states' rights people, in other words, a lot of the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, they're going to really have a lot to say about extending federal power through the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so this is where you don't have to worry too much about the specifics here, but Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, definitely the effect here. These are going to be resolutions that were presented by Jefferson and also Madison to these two state legislatures. Now you might say, well, Mr. Baker, Kentucky. Yeah, it's a state by then. Okay, so therefore, we've already started to see an expansion of new states entering the Union, which will create a whole other set of concerns and even issues down the line. Okay, so anyway, something to keep in your mind. But what do they do? So they encourage nullification. Okay, now this sets off a big sizable debate, which is, do the states have the right to nullify? This is not the only nullification crisis. I mean, you're going to have another one in the 1830s with President Jackson with South Carolina, where the story with that, guys, is that President Jackson got so angry at his VP, John C. Calhoun, over this issue, amongst other things, that he threatened to hang him from the first tree of his home state of South Carolina. Now, if you know anything about Jackson, Jackson is a pretty rough and tough guy, right? So that might not surprise you. So the point is here, guys, is that nullification is not going to go away. You're going to have that mode of thinking that people have, that if something violates the sanctity of states, that the state should have the right to say, federal law, no, we're not going to have to follow it. Okay. The downside of that is, guys, if you think about it, is that you're going to have to uphold it. So if you go back to last week and you look at the Whiskey Rebellion with President Washington, Washington made a decision. He said, hey, this is a law of the federal government. Doesn't matter whether you like it or not. Basically, too bad, so sad. You have to follow it. And he basically, of course, as you all know by now, took the action to make sure it was followed through with. Jackson, moving down the line with his nullification issue, does something very similar to, of course, Washington. Okay, so this nullification crisis sets off a big, big controversy that will continue to build upon itself to the point where you could argue we eventually have these rights and issues leading to an eventual, what we call a civil war. Stay tuned for that toward the end of the quarter. Now, foreign policy-wise, with John Adams, I think there's one thing that we have to really give Adams a lot of credit for, and that is, this is not on the slide, but just something to think about, guys, food for thought. There's a lot of pressure from his party, the Federalists, to have a war with France. There's a quasi-war, as some people like to call it. What is quasi? Well, it's basically a kind of like an under-the-table kind of conflict at sea, right, naval. But John Adams does not cave in to make it large scale. One historian, I think, I can't take credit for this, but this one historian that I read a book from a while back and also saw him in a documentary, made a really good observation about Adams, giving him some positive praise here with how he handles some things. He said that had Adams caved in to a state of war with France, now we're talking about a declared war, that the history of the United States would have looked very, very different. And I think that's him trying to say that, you know what, Adams held off some of the pressure and basically did what he felt was right. You got to remember, we're still a young republic, all right? Go back to 1776. This is around 1798, 1799. We're about 22, 23 years of age. That's still, in my mind, pretty young. So he's got to make, again, kind of like that principal guys of Washington with this, the office is not new to Adams as far as the office being created, but he's still defining it. And you're not going to have a country to define if you don't probably make some wise choices, maybe even some careful choices. Okay. One thing that he does that I think is really important, though, that would be important to note, is that there is going to be some friction between us and the French over what became known as the XYZ Affair. Okay. Now, X, Y, and Z eventually are going to be these three diplomats that were in France. Americans are there to do diplomacy. They expect these bribes, in other words, money for negotiations and talks. From what I understand, this was not really completely uncommon in some European circles for negotiating diplomacy. But evidently, Americans, and we have some people that have been abroad. You know, Adams is familiar with England. Of course, Jefferson familiar with France. But nonetheless, we see this as kind of like a form of disrespect. So these American diplomats were like, nope, we're not basically going to negotiate. And it's almost like they kind of walked out. Now, you could look at this in one of two ways. That's not really a good thing if, in fact, you're thinking war is maybe the next step, which we said eventually it's done in a very under-table fashion, but not a declared fashion. The other side of the coin is that you could argue that this is a sign of respect, right? Because we're trying to prove a point. We're trying to prove a point that while we're not maybe a world power, you know, I would not really use that expression for the United States until really, I would say, after the Spanish-American War. There's different interpretations there, so take it for what it's worth, okay? But what we can say is that this is a step in the right direction to at least try to make the world know that America is going to negotiate on certain terms, and they're not always going to be your terms, okay? So you can kind of interpret that as you like, but the fact there is that, you know, these diplomats basically did not go through with the bribes. Now, there is, excuse me, guys, going to be an important thing that we call the Convention of 1800. Okay, something that we have to keep in mind, and we're almost finished, I promise, is that there's a big debate still about that alliance that goes all the way back to, of course, the American Revolution. All right, and by then, keep in mind, guys, you're seeing a transition with the French Revolution going all the way back to 1789. Well, this period of time, you've gone through, you know, I think it was over 90 different constitutions that define the French government after the revolution. So that's a lot of change, right? You're seeing a lot of warfare with Europe. Eventually, in the late 1790s, you're going to see the rise of Napoleon, right? Short dead dude, as Bill and Ted in their Excellent Adventure refer to him as. Okay, but at the end of the day, what you notice is that you have debate about this. Do we support the French? Do we support them not? What this does, guys, the part of the Convention of 1800 is, I think you need to know the big idea here, bigger than just Convention of 1800, that we are formally going to come to a conclusion with that alliance. Okay. Washington would probably be pretty happy about this in some ways, because remember, in his farewell address, be very, very mindful of permanent alliances. Okay. That alliance goes back to 1777, 1778, shortly after the Battle of Saratoga, I think it was. And so is 20 plus years permanent? Well, obviously it ends, but that's the question that's going through people's minds. Okay. A good modern day example of that would be, guys, I like to try to bring attention to you kind of like in context then and now, is when you're looking at organizations like the United Nations or NATO or other groups that are these alliances, military, political, etc. You know, are those what we would call permanent? Well, both those alliances at this point in time, you know, go back to the 1940s, so they're well over 70 years old, right? So that's something to keep kind of in the back of your mind. The other thing that this does is it does not basically take away our trade with France, but it basically enhances it. And the thing, guys, to keep in mind is that our trade with the French and the British is very, very important. We're going to see how important that is when a decision is going to be made. This will be lesson 2 this week under President Jefferson, when the Congress passes and he eventually signs what became known as the Embargo Act of 1809. We cut off trade with every world nation, not just the French and the British. That almost completely railroaded certainly our international economy to an extent, and almost the economy within. And you might say, well, okay, there's domestic things that we can trade in different regions, which is true. But this is a sign, guys, at least in the era of Adams, that expanding trade with Europe is still seen as an extremely important thing. Okay. I want to end with this, and we'll pick it up next time as a review. So Adams, as we said, is a one-term president. The 1800 election, which we'll go into more detail next, is very, very important. Adams does run for re-election, but you've got Thomas Jefferson who runs again, and you've also got a guy by the name of Aaron Burr. Okay, a lot of you have heard of him, especially if you watch the of course Hamilton musical. So what happens? Well, Adams is clearly going to not be winning, but there's not enough of an electoral college vote to actually elect successfully either Jefferson or Burr. Now, this is interesting. Who does actually Hamilton support? Jefferson. And there's a little clip, guys, if you ever watched the play, where it's like, Alexander Hamilton, support him, you know. And they're all looking around like, oh my goodness, right now, I maybe made your ears just bleed. That wasn't my intent there, but there's surprise. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you didn't know this, the Constitution says that if the if the Electoral College cannot give the president enough votes to be formally elected, that the vote then needs to go to the House of Representatives. Well, Hamilton advocates for Jefferson to an extent again. Now, part of that is probably he sees them, he might see them, and in some cases, there's historical evidence that would show this, that, you know, he's the lesser of two evils compared to Burr. Of course, that rivalry with Burr will further develop, and we'll look at that next time, okay, if time allows. But at the end of the day, the Congress does, in fact, the House, that is, they vote to basically give the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is going to basically take the oath of office in March of 1801, the third president, keep in mind, and he basically refers to this victory as a quote-unquote revolution of 1800. Is he being arrogant, or does he have a significant point to make? Stay tuned next time. For those of you who are in my class, really quick, keep in mind a couple of reminders. You have an assignment to do between tonight and midnight on your first day. It's a Jefferson Hamilton Ideas assignment. We will spend about 15 minutes on Thursday, if time allows, toward the end of that hour block, breaking it down, seeing what you think about it. Please do a good job. I grade, based off of the quality of what you're submitting. We're looking for you to really develop your ideas well, referring to the documents, and certainly bringing your own interpretation into it. Okay? So remember, interpretation, guys, is that second tier of understanding. The first tier is factual. What happened? How can you describe the event? The second tier is you're interpreting events, documents, whatever it might be, and you're making your own personal kind of like thesis or thought on, whatever the argument might be or whatever. Okay? I want you to start working also on your week 2 readings. Keep in mind, you should be looking at the objectives and also previewing the vocab. The outline, you can probably get it in class. Bring that with you. Keep in mind, I think we're on page 2. Make sure you've submitted your syllabus to the Canvas portal. You will not start to see grades on day 1 assignments until that's been done. Okay, so you might see 1s out of 50s in there. Okay, so please help yourself out there and so forth. And then we will start to look at the age of Jefferson and his presidency. Right, we'll spend about 45 minutes on that next time, and then move into our discussion of our document. Okay, I'd like to get to know you, so please also get your getting to know you meeting. This is Baker signing off. If you need to contact me, please do so at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. Hope you all feel like your first couple of weeks have been a good one, and feel free to reach out if you need anything. And I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you for your time.